Hi, I'm Ryan McNamara from Maroon TV. I'm here with Rapp of the very good Slate. She is running for VP of Administration. So Holly, first, please tell me a little bit about the role of student government with the administration.
Sure. So the role of student government with the administration sort of varies year by year depending on the slate and depending on the relationships that they've built with the administration. But over the past few years, I've seen that it's growing in a really positive way. And that student government has an increasing influence on the administration, largely in part to the Impact Slate of 2 years ago and the Connect Slate of before them. And so it's sort of just a role of advocacy for the students and bringing student concerns to the administration and making them aware of things that maybe they weren't. And in some cases they already are aware, but perhaps they don't realize how serious the issue is to students. And so it's sort of just a role of pushing them to take an interest and to really listen to what the students are saying. And I think that a lot of students on this campus have sort of a negative view of the administration. Certainly there are decisions that are made with less student input than we would like. But it can be a positive relationship. I think that first and foremost, the administration is here to help the students. They just have perhaps longer term goals than students often do. And so there's a disconnect between students who care about the next year, the next 2 years, and the admin who's thinking in terms of decades. So sometimes it's difficult to find common ground, but it's certainly possible. And we think that it can be a really beneficial relationship.
So you mentioned sort of a disconnect between what students want and what they think and what the administration is planning for. Do you think there's a way, or how do you plan on helping students recognize that maybe there's more going on here, help understanding between the two groups?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's definitely very hard. We recently have the issue of the dorm closings going on because for students, if you're a first year or second year, you really don't care as much beyond your 4 years here because, after 2016, you might be gone on campus. And so what really matters to you is your experience over the next few years. And for the administration, they're worried about the reputation of the school or the experience of students 10 years from now. Which may, in some cases, be at the expense of the experience in the immediate future. And so that's really difficult when people have different scope of interest in terms of helping campus. But I've talked to administrators before in my time on student government, and they really aren't the evil people that sometimes we make them out to be. And they do care. They do not have to work in university administration. A lot of them choose to work with students and choose to meet with students. And I think that comes because they really do care. They're put in a tough spot because they have to care about the long-term goals of the university. But they chose a profession that sort of made them interact with students on a regular basis. And so, they're certainly relatable, they're willing to listen and do what they can. But I think there just needs to be more understanding on both sides.
And so you mentioned the housing issue, and that was a big deal. A lot of people felt that they were uninvolved. Mm-hmm. And I guess, how do you help students realize that, one, the administration isn't there to hurt you, and two, how do you just ensure that their opinions are heard and maybe incorporated to similar decisions?
Sure. So I think that a lot of the hurt with this most recent issue is that the administration presented it as if they were going to take student input. When Pierce closed, all the houses that were moved out of Pierce were told, you will move back into North when the time comes, and we want you to be a large part of that transition. And so there is a committee in place, and it does meet, and I think that a lot of the logistics of North will come out of student input on that committee in terms of what the house lounges should look like and what the sort of geography of the house should be. And so there are certainly realms of student input on that. However, obviously, the decision came as a shock and is not what most students would have liked. And it also sort of gives off the vibe that they don't care about the Chicago quirkiness of those houses, which is a really big deal. I remember when I was looking at UChicago, one of the most unique features was the housing options. And I lived in South, so I'm not directly affected by this, but I always sort of liked that those options were there. And, that the names of those houses tell a really interesting legacy of notable scholars or, people in the past who deserve to be preserved. And so I think that the next year is going to be really important in terms of student government's relationship with the administration. And while I do think that, students could work to understand the administration a little more, I'm certainly on the side of the students on this issue, and I hope that we can make strides in at least preserving the house names, possibly even, helping them rethink the decision to close those houses. Because it's important and it matters and it's a large part of our U Chicago identity. And I think that even the administration has an interest in preserving that.
You mentioned that next year is going to be, a really important year for relationship between student government and the administration. And how are you going to make sure that relationship evolves in, a positive way?
Sure. So student government is sort of in a unique position to get meetings with administrators, and it's sort of endowed with a sort of legitimacy of being elected representatives. So we are in a good spot to talk to the administration. It's sort of on us to be respectful and approachable and make the administration want to work with us. And a lot of that is almost just a feature of personalities and, professional working relationships. But we've also talked about on our slate implementing different executive positions to help us with this, because there's a lot of different community voices on campus that don't have the same access to administration that we do. And we think it's sort of naive to pretend that we are necessarily the best people to be in those conversations in some cases. So for example, we were just talking about the other day, implementing a position that would come from a community of sexual assault survivors or sexual assault allies who could then be endowed with a position on student government and hopefully have the access to administrators that we do. And so that would sort of bring an authentic voice to those conversations, but also, give those communities a more direct access line. So there's a lot of different ways, and it depends a lot on us and the cabinet that we establish, and the administrators and their willingness to work with us. But I think that it'll be a good year.
Great. Well, Holly, that's all we have time for,
Yeah.
but thank you so much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
your time, and best of luck in the upcoming elections.
Thank you. It was great meeting you.
Hi, I'm Ryan McNamara with Maroon TV. I'm here with Katherine Shen with the very good Slate. She is running for VP for Student Affairs. So Katherine, first off, just please tell me, what kind of connections do you have with students and student life that qualifies you for this position?
Sure. So I guess the most natural answer to that would be I am involved with RSOs because that's a really critical component of student life. And I guess another part is I'm currently a member of Student Government Finance Committee, so I sit on this committee every single week and we look over student budgets. And even though that's more of an oversight role, I have just a lot more understanding of the kind of events that students hold, the kind of RSOs that are on campus, and the diversity of student sort of interests and the diversity of the student body out there.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned you were in RSOs, and that's probably very important for someone that's applying for the student life position. Do you think you have a sort of unique perspective because you're with RSOs?
Sure. So I would say the most interesting sort of perspective I have is being involved with two very similar RSOs, one of which is very big and established, the other of which is very small. And I'm referring to the Chicago Debate Society, which is the larger academic team. It's well established, it's a part of the coalition of academic teams, and it gets a lot of money every year to go to competitions. And I'm also involved with the the British Parliamentary Debate Team. So this is a much smaller RSO. It started last year, and it mostly attracts international students. And I'm also an international student, which is why I guess I got involved with that. And I think seeing sort of the differences and the struggles that a large RSO has versus like a small RSO, that gives me this really interesting perspective about sort of how different the concerns are. So for example, for a smaller RSO, a lot of the issues is about funding and how to get this RSO started, how do you grow it, whereas for a larger RSO, it's about how to maintain the growth, maintain the amount of funding they get. And I guess, that's really important to me to basically incorporate, understand this diversity of opinions. And I guess it also comes through in our platform where we have an RSO support section, and we really want to basically incubate new RSOs. I'm not sure if Mike talked about this, but it's basically sort of like giving more funding to smaller RSOs so that they can fundraise, so that they can sort of get their capital started, and supporting them because they need that extra help in order to become a sustainable and active sort of part of campus.
So, building off of that, and I guess this would be something well past your administration, but I don't know if you have, visions. At what point would an RSO, reach where they don't necessarily need as much funding? How does that become determined? What really separates the really big ones that don't need so much from the small ones in your mind?
Okay,
so how would you go determining that?
Sure. So I guess just to clarify, I think larger RSOs actually get more funding rather than less. It's because they're sort of well established, because they have performed well in state competitions or have a lot of members, that they do get that larger budget. So we're not actually giving them less money per se. But I think we need to sort of understand how small, how big RSO is by, like pretty obvious factors, like how old it is, how many members it has, sort of how many events does it hold per year. Because I think each and every RSO is unique, right? And I think a current problem, the way funding works, is that a lot of RSOs are lumped under one big umbrella and they're treated in very similar ways despite having very different concerns. So for instance, like, some RSOs, the only thing they do is sort of bring in big speakers. And I know for a fact that sometimes SGFC is more reluctant to fund honorariums. And I think that's a really big problem because sometimes the RSOs solely exist to bring in like big speakers, right? And I think like understanding that there are RSOs like this and creating, say, like a separate honorarium pot is really crucial to supporting these like unique organizations.
Cool. And then, so how do you, shifting gears a little bit from
Sure.
RSOs, how do you plan on improving the image of student government to the student body? I've talked to a lot of people. Some people say, what is student government? What do they do? So how do you plan on really helping build a positive image to the student body?
Okay, sure. So I think this is a very big concern all student government in the past few years. And like you said, there's like a legitimacy problem, right? And I think a really big part is getting students more involved, and not just sort of class representatives, because that's the most obvious way. But I think what Holly mentioned before, having these liaison positions, for example, the student health liaison, somebody who actually is more intimately connected with communities on campus that care about sexual assault, care about mental health issues, care about sort of the issues the university administration has with how they interact with students with these problems, right? And I think it's rather foolish to assume that like 3 people can encompass the entirety of the student body, and sort of creating these positions, after you have been voted in rather than before, and sort of recognizing your own sort of your own like ignorance in some ways is really important, and actively reaching out for student opinion rather than sort of assuming that what's the best way forward for the entire student body.
Cool. Well, Katherine, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for coming by. Really appreciate it, and best of luck in the upcoming elections.
Thank you.